Thank you all very much indeed. I'd just like to say a couple of things about our last speaker. Brian, that was an extremely interesting presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, in case you don't know who Brian Gillen is and where he comes from, let me tell you that those of you who were worried about Norton going racing should know that Brian was the man who led the MV Agusta World Supersport team that came so close to winning the World Supersport Championship. And he also was the man who got MV Agusta into superbike racing. And anybody who followed the exploits of Leon Camier on the single MV Agusta machine in World Superbike, where he kept on repeatedly finishing fourth and never quite got on the box, that's Brian Gillen that led that. So racing, Norton will go racing, I'm sure, when and as they can. First, they've got to have a product. Secondly, they've got to have a manufacturing entity. That's all coming along. Don't be too impatient. I will also say, let me give myself a plug. Those of you who want to know more about TVS and why TVS acquired Norton should buy next month's Motorcycle Sport and Leisure, because my interview with Sudarshan Venu, who is the MD of TVS and the man who actually signed the check, figuratively speaking, to purchase Norton, will be in that magazine. So Motorcycle Sport and Leisure, I think it's a November issue. And that's just before, of course, the Motorcycle Live show here in Birmingham at the NEC, which is when Norton will be relaunched as a brand with an array of novelties. Brian alluded to 3 different platforms, 6 new models. Sudarshan Venu refers to that, gives more details about that in my interview with him. So, exciting times for Norton, very timely that Brian was here to fill us in. However, I'm going back in time to 51 years ago, actually really 52 years ago, because that's when the John Player Norton team raced in Formula 750. There was no world championship for that at that stage, but the John Player Norton is often believed by many to be Norton's last gasp in competition motorcycle racing. Okay, we have the Steve Hislop TT winning rotary, the Abbas rotary over there, and that was the true last gasp, but this was with a rotary engine. The John Player Norton were the last reciprocating poppet valve motorcycles which Norton not exactly ruled the world, but Norton was super competitive with, and that came thanks to one man. The man who conceived them, the man who designed the chassis, the man who acted as a development rider, and who rode the bike in races and won with it, won with them. And that man was the late, great Peter Williams. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about Peter. And he's going to be coming in and out of the story as we go through the different iterations of the JPM. Because I will admit to be glad to say Peter was a good friend of mine. And I spoke to him many times, on and off the record, on and off tape recorders, as we had in those days, voice recorders, about John Player Norton and about the art of matchless, famous wagon wheels, and about his early days in road racing. So I put these snippets, interview items, in my various articles about John Player Nortons. Peter, unfortunately, is no longer with us. He passed away in 2020. So I'm going to do the next best thing, which is I'm actually going to read out the comments that he made about the bikes as if he were here with us today. I hope that'll be a good way of telling you why he did what he did. Let's just say a little bit about him first, though. Everybody thought Peter was very sort of studious-looking, bespectacled, obviously a university graduate. Well, actually not. His father was the legendary designer Jack Williams, AMC, creator of the matchless G50, for those of you who know about that bike. And he was himself a very good racer, but he concentrated more on engineering rather than the racing, whereas Peter did it the other way around. He started out on racing and then did the engineering. He actually was an engineer who learnt his trade at the Ford Motor Company, where he was a draftsman. And he then started racing motorcycles just as a club rider, as a hobby. And he worked in Ford's drawing office at Dagenham and started racing quite late, age 24. He did so with British bikes. And he was very proud of the fact that he very rarely ever rode a foreign bike. It's not many people who have actually turned down the chance to race for the Suzuki factory team. He forfeited the ride with Honda. Mike Hailwood was a good friend of his and obviously a great fan. So after Mike moved to cars, he recommended Peter to take his place with the Honda factory team. And that was actually in print, so to speak. He had signed a pre-contract to race for Honda. But then Honda had a strategic change, and in 1967 they stopped motorcycle racing, officially. So that didn't happen. He also declined an offer to work for Yamaha as a designer. So the racing was still in his blood, so he didn't want to give that up. And in fact, except for one other company, he only ever rode British bikes. That company was MZ. And he won MZ's final Grand Prix race victory on the 300cc twin at the Ulster Grand Prix in 1971. So, how did he become involved with Norton? Let's do the other way around. Dennis Poor was the man who basically saved Norton. He was a venture capitalist. His company, Manganese Bronze, acquired AMC, as John told us earlier. When it went bust in 1966, he bought it in 67. And he realized that Norton had considerable potential. And so he focused on Norton as the key brand out of the ones that he'd acquired. I'm not quite sure how he and Peter first got to know each other, but by those days, Peter was working for Greaves. He'd done development. Thank you. He had been racing for Greaves and then joined Tom Arter and raced the Arter 7R. It used to be the Surtees 7R. And also the Matchless G50, the Arter Matchless, eventually became known as Wagon Wheels. Peter was a very innovative engineer. Well, racer as such. He was the first person to use an integral helmet, a one-piece helmet, full-face helmet, in Grand Prix racing. He was the first person to use disc brakes on all his bikes. First person to use cast magnesium wheels, aluminium or magnesium. He designed them himself when he was injured, long-term injury, after crashing in the rain in the Sachsenring in East German Grand Prix. Anyway, he was offered a job at Norton as originally a draftsman, a designer, and he agreed to do it provided he'd be able to work on his bikes in the Norton R&D shop in Thruxton. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to get anybody from the Thruxton shop to come and be here with us today, because it would have been great to have talked to some of them about what it was really like there. Peter went there as an engineer, but he established a rapport with Dennis Poor, and as such, he had to do racing as well as development work. So he forged a new career as a successful big bike rider, and he won the Thruxton 500 miler with Charlie Sandby, as well as many races on the new Commander. And he was responsible for developing the Norville, the Yellow Peril. We had hoped to have one of them here, but unfortunately didn't make it. And he should have won the production TT, in 1971, but unfortunately ran out of petrol on the last lap and was passed on the line by, I think it was Malcolm Uphill. Yes, it was Malcolm Uphill on a Triumph. Terrible. Not the first time this happened, though, as we're going to see in a minute. So, how did he get involved with John Player Norton? Dennis Poor decided that as a former car racer himself, and as we were just discussing with Brian Gillen just now, racing improves the breed, but it also adds luster and allure to the brand. And Dennis Poor believed very strongly in that, again, as a former car racer. He decided to give Peter Williams the budget to develop a Norton Special with a 750cc engine. In those days, British bike racing was changing. Until then, it had all been traditional Grand Prix classes, 250, 350, 500, which were preeminent. But in the early 70s, the big unlimited class became more and more popular, in reflecting, I suppose, the bikes that people were buying on the street. So they built this special Norton, and Peter won a lot of races on it. It particularly brought customers to Norton who wouldn't have come otherwise. And Poor decided that this meant that it would be justifiable for him to invest in Norton going racing with its own specially designed Formula 750 bikes. Formula 750 class was just catching on then, invented in America, brought over to Europe in the Imola 200 in 1972, won by Paul Smart on the Ducati V-twin. So that was a class that was growing, but also commercially related. So Dennis Poor decided that Norton would have a three-man team to go Formula 750 racing. He also decided to do it in the same way as Formula One, with a major sponsor. Until now, this had never been done, and particularly never with a tobacco sponsor. Gold Leaf Team Lotus in 1968, I think, is generally considered to be the first tobacco-sponsored race team, and the first wholly branded Formula One race team. Dennis Poor took a leaf out of that, and he went to John Player and negotiated for John Player to sponsor the Norton team in 1972 with their blue and white number 10 brand. Anybody ever smoke number 10s? Okay, you helped provide Norton with the budget to go racing. Okay, so what bike are we going to go racing with? Well, this was the start, really, of what people often think of as a footnote in British motorcycle racing history, but it's not. The John Player Norton team brought together a very avant-garde, high-tech chassis design technology with a strong aerodynamic influence, and yet in a bike powered by a, somewhat archaic overhead valve, pushrod motor, parallel twin motor too, with no balance shafts. Even in those days, BSA Triumph had a 3-cylinder engine, 750 obviously. Ducati had their V-twins, Laverda, Benelli had their parallel twins, and then there were the Japanese. Honda already had a 4-cylinder 750. The Japanese two-strokes from Suzuki and Kawasaki produced a huge amount more power than the four-strokes, but they had to be corralled somehow or other. The horses had to be put to the ground. So the original idea of a John Player Norton being competitive in Formula 750 international racing was really hope more than expectation. So Peter told me that we knew we'd have our hands full with the Suzuki triples. since although they had appalling handling, that was why they were called the Flexi Flyers, if you ever remember that. They did produce around 115 horsepower, and so they were very fast at Daytona when we debuted our first John Player Norton. We could outhandle them, but at that stage, with only 69 horsepower at 7,000 RPM, and that was just only over 14 horsepower more than the standard Commando engine, we had to have a way of increasing our top speed. The other problem was that we had to carry 24 litres of fuel to be able to get away with at least one less fuel stop than the Suzukis and the other thirstier bikes in the 200-mile race. But how to do this without jacking up the centre of gravity and increasing the frontal aspect, as well as having a fuel tank so big that the rider would be unable to tuck himself away behind the fairing and would thus increase the frontal area and so reduce speed. That's a conundrum. Well, Peter resolved that by copying a format which is his father, Jack, not only the creator of the matchless G50, but also the creator of the AJS 7R3A, which Rod Coleman won the 1954 Junior TT on. This was the pannier tank AJS, and it had a one-piece fuel tank that was draped over the frame, and I think there is one here in the museum. The actual bike that won the races in America at Team Obsolete, but I believe they have another bike of that here. Let's have a look at it afterwards. So Peter adopted the same concept for the first John Player Norton, which is, everybody refers to it as the pannier tank John Player. So he fitted pannier tanks which partially enclosed the engine, and they were carefully shaped so as that he, the rider, could seat down low. And that way completely filled in the otherwise dead space between the fairing and the motor. So the only problem with this was you couldn't use gravity feed for the carburetors. So they had to have a fuel pump. And rather than have an electrical one, which then would have meant you had to add the battery, more problems with weight, more problems with real estate, they actually used a mechanical fuel pump of a Volvo car, which was operated by the swing arm. So as the swing arm went up and down, it pumped the fuel from the pannier tank up to the carb, because they had a header tank just above the carburetors. Now, this is honestly true, and I've done it. In order to be able to start the bike, you had to bounce up and down on the suspension to get fuel into the header tank. You could then get somebody to push you because it was impossible to run alongside the bike and then leap aboard. A fact recognized by the fact that Formula 750 races were all clutch start. So even though push starts pertained in Grand Prix racing right up until the mid-80s, I think it was 1986, they finally got replaced by clutch starts. When you started in the paddock, you had to do that. You couldn't actually just sit there warming up the engine. You had to bounce up and down on the seat as well. And this became a common humorous point of watching the John Player team go racing. Mind you, they did it under very, very special circumstances, because the John Player transporter was this extremely luxurious American Ford V8 contraption, which had spacious interior, including a workshop for transporting the bikes, powered by a 7-litre V8 motor. It would cruise at 100 miles an hour, all the way down to Imola or somewhere like that. And you still have to have a bike that you bounced up and down on the seat while you were warming the engine. However, it worked. So they made their debut at Daytona, and Peter's teammate was Phil Reed, then the reigning 250cc world champion with the privateer Yamaha, in which he beat Rod Gould on the factory Yamaha. That's a whole other story. And they also had a third rider, who to begin with was Tony Rutter, But Tony didn't really get on. He'd only ridden two strokes, and he didn't really get on with riding four strokes, so he withdrew fairly early on and was replaced by Mick Grant. And Mick actually rode the John Players for 2 years, 72 and 73. Didn't ride in 74. Dave Croxford came along in 73 and did 74 as well. That makes me, sorry to say, be so pleased with myself, I think I'm the only living person to have ridden all three different kinds of John Player Nortons, 72, 73, 74. Why? How come? Well, the reason is because another close friend of mine, my former teammate in historic Grand Prix racing, is named Joaquin Folch. And I know many of you have, I see some common friends in the room who've met him and know him. Joaquin is a very wealthy Spaniard from Barcelona who is dedicated his life to motorcycling, has a fabulous private motorcycle collection in his country house outside Barcelona, and became a Norton owner at quite a young age. And he got his first bike when he was 18. How? Well, Spain was one of Norton's biggest export markets. And the reason was that when General Franco was in power, he banned the importation of Japanese motorcycles because he wanted to protect the local brands like Bultaco, Montesa, Ossa, Sanglass, etc. So that applied also to the racing. So nobody could import a TZ350 Yamaha or a Suzuki Flexi Flyer. All the Formula 750 races, or the Spanish Superbike Championship, as they were called, were contested between Norton, Triumph, Moto Guzzi, Harley Davidson, etc. European brands, Ducati, how can I forget that? The importer was a man called Juan Antonio Rodez, and his company was Challenge Motors. Coincidence, later on, Norton had the Norton Challenge. And he did very well, sold a lot of bikes to a lot of people. It was the #1 brand for wealthy people in Spain to ride. That meant that when the John Player Norton Formula 750 package got underway, each year there was a new model. So Rodez would acquire one of the previous year's bikes. And to begin with, he bought one 72 pannier tank machine. He didn't get a monocoque, which is what came in 73, as we'll see in a minute. But he did also buy two space frames, 74 space frames. The first season they raced the pannier tank in 73. It won several races, but always in the hands of a different rider. So they didn't win the championship. He was just getting started. But for 75, they got, as I said, two space frames. And Benjamin Grau, who may be a name familiar to you, top 125 and 50cc Grand Prix racer, diminutive, he's about this tall, fitted the bike very well. Grau won every single round of the Spanish Superbike Championship, sponsored by Pedro Domecq Sherry. And quite coincidentally, their colours were red, white and blue. So the bikes basically had the John Player special colours. However, when the factory shut down in 75, Rodez had no more stock coming. So he had to shut the business. But he had these racers sitting there. Who could I possibly sell them to? Ah, Mr. Folch. He already had started a collection of classic bikes, quite small, only about 10 or 12 at the time. But he did have an ex-John Grace 500 Max Norton. So, Mr. Folch, would you like to buy my 3X Works Nortons? Yes, he did. And that's how the largest collection of John Player Nortons today is in Spain. I should say that Joaquin is an extremely good rider. And the following month, after buying the three bikes, he took the ex-Grau championship winner to the Barcelona La Rabassada hill climb, which is about a 14-kilometer hill climb away from Barcelona city, up over the hill behind the city, and then halfway down to the finish. And he won his class in that. So that was the final competitive appearance in modern racing of a John Player Norton. Let's go back to the pannier tank, so to 72. The one problem that the bike had was the gearbox. Essentially, it was a standard Commando gearbox, and it was producing much more power and especially torque than the standard engine had been used to producing. So the eventual solution to this for 73 was an outrigger bearing on the gearbox shaft, which at the same time allowed them to fit a 5-speed gearbox, which was robust enough to last the distance. And from then on, there were no more gearbox problems. However, the bike still needed to have extra performance. And it was gradually developed over the first season to produce, I've got the figure here, 74 horsepower. But this was still the long-stroke engine. And it was torquey, but not particularly fast. However, for British short-circuit racing, it was also relatively light, and that meant that it handled very well, especially with the low-down center of gravity. So Peter was a great addict. Let me just see if I can find the comments that he put in about that. So he said, although we learned a lot that first year, it was all really rather problematical, and the results weren't as good as we'd have liked. The oil bath gearbox was the main bone of contention, partly because of the extra power, and also partly because the Norton primary transmission had never been asked to cope with the speeds involved in 150-mile-an-hour racing. Phil Reed qualified the bike for the Daytona 200 in the days when they had a single lap of the Bank Speedway as the qualifiers. And he qualified at 155 miles an hour, so that was the top speed of the first John Player Norton. The use of a triplex chain primary drive instead of the Commando street bike's single primary chain imposed a bending force on the shaft owing to the greater width. The chain pull exerted a significant leverage on the main shaft, which bent it, and the teeth were peeled off due to too much unit load being imposed on them as a result of being out of line with the mating gear on the lay shaft. This was no reflection on Rod Quaife, who built the 5-speed clusters and tried manfully to help us solve the problem. It was simply an inherent fault of the Norton primary drive. So the eventual cure for this was an all-new dry clutch from 1973 with the outrigger extra bearing to support the main shaft. From the humble 69 horsepower Daytona, engine development produced throughout the 72 season to the point that the team was able to eventually extract 76 horsepower at 7,500 RPM from the long stroke 73 by 89 millimeter 745cc engine. So this had Carrillo rods, skimmed cylinder head, 10.3 to 1 compression, and made it a Peter Williams designed camshaft operating chrome moly steel bush rods via lightened rocker arms. So anybody here who's got a standard Commando of the era, that's what they did to your engine. However, the main thing was the frame. The 72 John Player frame had been designed by Peter Williams a couple of years earlier following his experiences with the Norton Special and the Commando Production Racer. So he kept the production bike's large diameter backbone tubing as well as the isoelastic mountings. That's really important. And so although a mid-season change from a Siamese 2-to-1 exhaust designed by Dr. Gordon Blair at Belfast University to twin separate pipes, this caused ground clearance problems, which necessitated a change from 18-inch to 19-inch wheels. But the Norton's debut season had provided the basis to move up a level in 73 with an all-new chassis powered by a short-stroke version of the Commando engine in a completely new bike. And this was the famous John Player monocoque. So Peter told me that the monocoque, whose, by the way, the windscreen height was 2.5 inches, 65 mil lower than the pannier tank, and that was already pretty low. Peter told me the following. He said, I had 4 parameters for designing the monocoque, 3 of which had been the rationale for the 72 pannier tank bike. A small frontal area, hence aerodynamic efficiency, plus a low center of gravity, and a reduced polar moment by placing the C of G in the right place, close to the center of mass, for easier handling. So these factors basically are the things that govern Grand Prix racing today. If you go and look at the Ducati Desmos 80G, you can see how the mass has been compacted in the center of the wheelbase. But 50 years ago, Peter Williams and the John Player Norton team were forging a pretty lonely path as the first people in the world to adopt this technology in building a race bike. You have to think of the monocoque as being radically different than any other motorcycle ever made before. The Ossa 250 GP monocoque, or Santiago Herrera, that had a frame acting as the fuel tank, or a fuel tank acting as a frame, in fact. But it was a quite different design because of the two-stroke. The John Player monocoque had different sections of it for petrol and for oil. And it was an extremely advanced application of motorcycle chassis technology. And this is what Peter said to me about it. 72 JPN was a stopgap measure to get us out on the racetrack. So while it incorporated some of these ideas, it was full of compromises, and the engine was too far forward for ideal handling. For 72, we'd moved the engine back in the frame by 1 inch relative to the wheel centers. Since with a 71 experimental special, we placed the engine much further forward than on the production Commando to prevent the front wheel lifting on acceleration because of the more powerful engine. But that year I noticed, especially at Silverstone, that if you really leant it into a corner, it was easy to make the back wheel step out under power, even with only 76 horsepower available. So it would break away very easy. For the monocoque, I built a really small bike that wrapped the rider around the engine, which allowed me to obtain the 4th parameter, which a 72 bike had hardly addressed, stiffness. Within the parameters of the isostatic rubber frame engine mountings, we had to include, for commercial reasons, because they featured on Norton's road bikes, we created a pretty stiff structure in the monocoque, and that's one reason why it handles so well. However, it took a while to get this done, and they only had 1 bike ready for the season opening race at Daytona, and I think Peter retired in that. Yeah, he did. But here we are. For the European season, things really changed. First of all, the bikes were decked out in a new livery. So the John Player Special was a new brand. And sorry, let me get my correct page. Here we are. So its incredibly low build allowed the John Player monocoque to use its reduced frontal area and the lower drag to counter the disadvantages of a modest power output. And this is something that Peter was particularly proud of. He said to me, we were able to reduce the drag coefficient to just 0.39 cx in the Mara wind tunnel. And one of the crucial factors in attaining this was smoothing the airflow over the rider's back, so that when lying prone on the tank, I designed a fairing with fully enclosed handlebars and a screen that was a whopping 5 inches lower than on the 72 bike. But yet it was just the right height in relation to the rider's shoulders when flat on the tank. So the airflow ran over the screen and down along your back. my leathers had no lettering on the back, which could disturb the airflow. So you remember in those days they used to put your name on your shoulders across the back? Forbidden. The seat design or rear fairing was just as important in smoothing the airflow. I was really proud of that drag figure. So they had a bit more power from the engine, 76 horsepower, and he tested the monocoque early on at the end of 1972, in fact, at Thruxton. And he also was very proud of the fact that he could, ride it in a very special way. He told me, "I'd proved on my old G50 what an incredible difference it made having your fuel mounted down low. It reduces the effort needed to change direction, lessens general instability around fast bumpy turns, and enables you to flick the bike to and fro, as well as decreases its pitch by reducing the polar moment. People often won't believe me when I say I could go into a corner on the monocoque, lay it on its side, and get both front and rear wheels sliding, then put the power on and keep it in a controlled two-wheel drift around any corner faster than Druids at Brands Hatch." Now, I don't know if anybody else was there that day, but I went to the Silverstone Formula 750 race meeting in August that year, and I saw this happen at Woodcote, where I was watching from. And the first time I saw it happen, it's about the third lap, I thought, oh, he's lost it. And then I realized, no, he hasn't. But you could see him power sliding the bike. Well, not power, because it wasn't just the rear wheel. He was sliding, he was drifting the bike around the corner at high speed. Incredibly, on such a fast circuit, he took the lead. And he was up against all the powerful factory two-strokes like Barry Sheen's Suzuki. Paul Smart was also riding Suzuki. Yvonne Duhamel's Kawasaki triple. The John Player Norton, the BSA and Triumph triples were still racing, even though, unfortunately, companies had gone bust. And yet, remember I said this before? The last lap, he ran out of petrol. How could they have underfueled it? Well, again. So, really, he won the monocoque. He won the Isle of Man Formula 750 TT that year on the bike. He finished he finished second in a TT race 7 times. 7 times second. That was his only race victory. By the way, remember that one of the reasons he finished second in the production TT because he ran out of petrol in the last lap. So, 4 times second to Agostini's MV on the Arto Matchless, and 7 times altogether second. However, that year he won, and Mick Grant was also second on the other John Player Norton, against far from negligible competition. Jack Findlay was riding a factory Suzuki. There were lots of other good people in the race, as well as all the BSA and Triumph triples. So he won at a record speed of 105.47 miles an hour, and he set a new lap record at 107.27 miles an hour. I don't know if any of you have watched on YouTube, but the BBC documentary, 1-hour documentary about that race from the point of view of the John Player team is available. So Google YouTube, 1973, John Player Norton. I'm very fortunate to, as I said before, to have ridden each of the different John Player Nortons. And in the case of the pannier tank, I've actually raced that in a classic club Formula 750 race in Britain. The chassis of the pannier tank is quite spacious, improbably so. It's a longer wheelbase than the standard Norton, and you feel molded to the fuel tank. It's a relatively easy bike to ride. The monocoque is very hard indeed. First of all, Peter by then had developed, he was obsessed with aerodynamics. So he developed this technique of narrowing the steering head of the bike, the yokes of the steering, and so your hands were much closer together, both on the Arta mattress, which is where he got the idea from, and the monocoque. So you were squeezing into this bike, which was built for him. I don't know whether Mick Grant got a special fitting or not. He just probably had to do whatever Peter wanted. I think they're more or less the same height. And he then arranged it so that he would ride every corner in as wide a trajectory as he possibly could. Now, of course, this was a derivative of the Arta G50 wagon wheels, where he was underpowered. The bike was underpowered against the three-cylinder, later four-cylinder MV Agustas. So he had to keep up momentum. And he actually led the 500cc World Championship in 1967 after 3 races. That was the year that Mike Hayward on the Honda and Ago on the MV Triple contested the championship so intensely. But one of them retired in each of the first 2 races, and Peter finished second to the other one in each of those 2, finished third to the 2 of them in Aston, and the result was, after 3 races, he led the World Championship, won the British single. Wasn't to last, unfortunately. Anyway, that was his riding style. So he used the high, wide, and handsome riding style as much as possible. The Norton it's the John Player Norton, the monocoque, is very, it's slim. It's nothing like no other bike to sit in. You have to somehow squeeze into a very snug, semi-forward inclined riding position. You put a lot of weight on your arms just actually getting into the bike. Can't possibly run and bump it. You have to be push started. And don't even think about waving to the fans on the last lap of the race, because you'll never get your hands back inside the fairing. If you do that, you're there. I must say that the step forward it represented, though, for motorcycle chassis design was significant. And it makes you wonder, what would it have been like if they put a bigger engine, a 4-cylinder engine even, let alone a 1000cc? It's got to be a pity that nobody else ever took up the John Player monocoque design and did something else with it with another engine. The main thing, as I said, was keeping up corner speed. And you learned how to do that. I rode it at Snetterton, which was in those days a much wider, faster circuit than even it is today. And I also rode it at Mallory Park, which is really the complete opposite. Didn't have the chicanes when I rode it at Mallory Park, though. And the one thing that I remember was absolutely awful about it was the brakes. Wouldn't stop. It had AP Lockheed's benchmark calipers, which I was racing a 750 SS Ducati in those days. I had Brembo cast iron front discs and that fabulous AP Lockheed caliper. So it wasn't the caliper was the problem, it was the discs. The fact that I remember the first season, 72, Peter only used a single disc. And that was one of the reasons why he went around corners so fast, I'm sure. He couldn't stop for them. But the second year he put on twin discs, but even so, it didn't get much bite. There were 3 bikes built all together, plus a 4th prototype, monocoque. And the prototype is the one that's in the museum here. All 4 bikes do still exist today. And Mike Braid, who is a well-known collector of bikes here in the UK, has one of the monocoques. He's got the Croxford one. And he brings that out from time to time. My friend Joaquin in Spain does bring all the John Player Nortons out from time to time in historic events in different countries. And in 1989, he brought it to the Isle of Man for the parade lap, and he rode it at pretty good speed in the parade lab, which fortunately then was an open event. You didn't have a car in front of you driving at 40 miles an hour down Bray Hill. And he allowed me to ride the space frame. And the space frame was what came up next. Unfortunately, it was a bike which Peter was very much against. The reason was that this is what he said. The space frame was built in 1974. It's completely different from the monocoque. And why was the monocoque discarded? He not only won the TT, he'd finished 5th in Laguna Seca's 450 race against all the two-strokes. He came very close to scooping the British Superbike Championship. He and Barry Sheene finished equal on points, and Barry won it only because he won one more race. And after just a single season of development, it was jettisoned in favor of a more traditional space frame design for 74, which, although 12 kilos lighter, was taller, less aerodynamic, and so slower. Neither Peter Williams nor Dave Cross could match the monocoque's lap times with the new bike. Why did it come about? Okay, Peter told me. Frank Perez was the team manager of John Player Norton. Frank Perez thought I should be concentrating more on riding than engineering, especially in training and preparing myself for races. Also, I was persuaded it was difficult to work on the monocoque engine at a race meeting because everything was too inaccessible. But years later, Norman White, one of the team mechanics, told me this definitely was not the case, and he found the bike easy to work on in the paddock. Sorry, Norman's not here. So I'm left with the third and most likely factor, which is jealousy. Partly my own fault, because when people asked me technical details about the bike, I always answered with I rather than we, because I designed it or I'd ridden it. It might have smoothed some feathers if I'd said we, but the monocoque chassis was very much my own personal project, which I conceived, I helped develop and raced myself on behalf of the John Player team. I'm very, very proud of it, even if it was a lost opportunity. Sadly, Peter had a very serious accident at Oulton Park in August 1974. One problem with the space frame chassis was that you couldn't wrap fuel around the engine. It had to be a fuel tank on top of a conventional chassis. And to get the mileage for longer races, they had a secondary fuel receptacle in the tail of the bike, which of course was catastrophic because it meant that as the fuel level went down, you had this fuel sloshing around in the back. Didn't help the handling. This was also held on by what amounted to rubber bands. And one of the rubber bands broke at Oulton Park. The whole unit fell off the back of the bike. Peter attached to it. He crashed and he severely damaged his left arm and was never able to use it again. So sadly, that's the unhappy ending to the John Player Norton saga. The company itself, as we unfortunately all know, went under in 1975. I will say this, that in my opinion, I believe that Dennis Poor behaved in an honourable way, tried extremely hard to save Norton, but there were political issues there to do with the Labour government in power at the time, and the fact that he was expected to sell the Triumph Bonneville that was made in the cooperative at the Meriden factory. He was expected to sell this against his own Norton Commandos made in Wolverhampton. So it was a sad ending to the whole Norton saga. Not the first time around, something like the fourth time around. But the John Player Norton story is a fabulous way for the brand to look in the rear view mirror of history. And I think Norton can be proud of what it achieved with that bike. And Peter Williams, particularly, has every reason to be proud of, had every reason, before he passed away, to be proud of his achievements with it. We can only hope that Brian Gillen and his colleagues are given the chance to try to repeat the success of the John Player Norton in future. Thank you all very much. Sorry.
I wonder if I can just say that we're very privileged today to have Peter's son Jack here with us.
Oh, wonderful.
Just lovely to
Stand up, please. Oh, that's wonderful. Jack, great to have you here. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming.